Yeah, excellent points. I will try to verbalize this chart just for our audio listeners a bit. So you have this period starting, this chart spans from 1988 to basically 2020. Real GDP and baseline growth track more or less perfectly all the way up to all the great financial crisis of 2008. Then there's a substantial divergence in that probably 2-year window. And then it is just continued to diverge ever since. I guess this would be kind of the silent depression you talked about. And there's the shortfalls increase, right? There's a delta of 2.3 trillion, then 3.4, then 5.5 most recently. When I say most recently, this looks like the beginning of 2020. So we're late 2021 right now. There's been some time. And there's a commensurate explosion in bank reserves. And I love how on this chart you say the only thing you need to know about bank reserves is if they go up, it's bad. And they appear to have exploded to almost 15, 16 trillion in 2015. They started to come back down, but then it looks like they've exploded again in the crisis of 2020. So maybe you could just give us a little more color about what's
the
going
other
on.
side of the scale. It's actually the reserves got up to around 5 trillion, 4.5, 5 trillion around 2014, which was that was the money printing. We got trillions of excess dollars.
This is Fed only?
Yeah, just the Fed. And it doesn't matter because the bank reserves or the ECB or the Bank of Japan, it's all the same thing. It doesn't really matter. What I tell people is, look, I understand why you think that's inflationary because you see that happen. You see that the Federal Reserve balance sheet is exploding. You see the level of bank reserves is exploding and people call this base money. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it should be base money, right? I mean, it's bank reserves, it's the Federal Reserve. What else would it be? Mm-hmm. And the answer is it's not base money. It's not effective money because we just spent all this time talking about this. Mm-hmm. The monetary system itself is something very different that developed outside the Federal Reserve. And it had no use for bank reserves because there weren't any. So it created its own forms of liquidity. It created its own forms of money, which the Federal Reserve realized half a century ago that it could not keep up with. And so people see the Federal Reserve's balance sheet explode and think that that's money printing. And that's the Fed's being reckless. They're going to kill the dollar, all that trillions of extra money printing. And then the financial media reinforces that message over and over again. Quantitative easing is pouring trillions of dollars into the real economy. Mm-hmm. But yet that statement is false in every single sense of it. It's what you can't see that matters. It's the money that's hidden in these offshore Eurodollar shadows that matters. And so if you see the Fed's balance sheet go up, what that tells you is something must be wrong in the hidden monetary system. Mm-hmm. So think that there's money contraction in the actual monetary system that is causing the Fed to respond to it. So when you see the Fed's balance sheet goes up, that's a response to a monetary deficit that's going on in the shadows that you can't see. And it's the Fed doesn't matter. The Fed, this bank reserves don't mean a damn thing. So it's not like you see the Fed's balance sheet going up and that's inflationary. You see the Fed's balance sheet going up and you think there's deflationary money going on in the stuff we can't directly see and observe. It's what you can't see that matters.
I love the way you put that because that gets back to it's mentioned in Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson, where he talks about the seen versus the unseen. I think he may have got that from Bastiat. But to your point, so we see the Fed's bank reserves exploding, but what we don't see, correct me if I'm wrong here, is this unsatisfied demand for dollars created by the Eurodollar system effectively. And so
what you also don't see is the anticipated positive effects of that money printing, right? If the Fed was actually printing money, then we would expect to see a recession, not a silent depression. Mm-hmm. We would expect to see inflation. We'd expect to see the dollar going down. And none of those things ever happen. Yeah. So again, it's what you don't see that actually tells you what's going on, which is this shadow money system. There's something wrong over here. Even though we can't see it, we know that it's wrong by all of these things, all of these symptoms that produce everything is consistent with these things going wrong. And by the way, that includes low interest rates. Low interest rates are a sign of tight money, not loose money. That's another something we've been taught the wrong thing from day one. People associate low interest rates with stimulus. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it should be, right? If you're reducing the cost of borrowing, Why wouldn't that be stimulus? And it's throughout history, you have to think about it in terms of what interest rates you're talking about. And usually what we're talking about is the interest rates on the most liquid and safe assets.
Right.
So the other side of the interest rate on a liquid safe asset is its price. And so if the price of liquid and safe assets is high and getting higher, what does that tell you about perceptions of liquidity and safety?
Right.
They obviously can't be very liquid or very safe, or the price of those instruments would go down. What Milton Friedman said is, as this interest rate fallacy, is that historically speaking, that's what you will see. Interest rates, especially benchmark rates, will be lower during periods of tight money, like the United States in the 1930s, the Great Depression. Rates were low, not high.
Yeah.
And conversely, in the 1970s, during the Great Inflation, rates went up. And they got up into double digits. They skyrocketed because during nominal inflation period where money is excessive, the last thing you want to own is something that's ultra safe and ultra liquid because liquidity is everywhere.
Right.
And you don't need it.
So
the fact that interest rates have gone lower over since 2008, again, we have that break, is a signal that the stuff you can see on the Fed's balance sheet is not money. It's not effective money because safety and liquidity are what's in high demand by the global marketplace rather than, the unliquided, unsafe, like, credit creation, loan, lending, that kind of thing.
So are we back to the risk adjusted price of interest rates versus the nominal price again? That what we see, what we see is not what is.
The risk-adjusted opportunities in the real economy must be significantly higher than what most people think. Otherwise, banks would not want to own the safe and liquid instruments. Right. It doesn't really matter about the nominal price. It's the risk-adjusted price, which, they're saying we only want to own safety and liquidity because obviously there isn't much safety and liquidity in the actual system, regardless of what the Federal Reserve does with its bank reserves. The level of bank reserves is immaterial to safety and liquidity.
Yeah. Is there a reliable proxy to convert that nominal interest rate to a risk-adjusted interest rate? Would it be something as simple as, I guess, choosing an inflation rate, which isn't necessarily easy or arbitrary? It is arbitrary, but it's not necessarily easy to just, you can't use CPI, let's put it that way, for most investors. Would it be just a matter of establishing an inflation rate and deducting that from the nominal interest rate to get a real yield? Is that how you back into a natural risk-adjusted interest rate?
The TIPS market gives you a real yield anyway, which that's based on the CPI, and the government pays CPI-based protection. But those real yields are relatively clean and relatively easy for the market to determine. Which you look at real yields today, they're obscene. They're ridiculously low. Yeah. The problem is we're taught to believe low real yields are something like stimulus. That's supposed to be inflation expectations that are supposed to be positive toward this expectations central banking regime. When in fact the market is telling you, no, this is bad. This is not good. Right. We don't need lower rates. We need actual effective money, which we're not getting, which is why nominal rates are so low to begin with. Again, safety and liquidity are in high demand.
So interesting.
So the real yields are essentially the economic consequences of a monetarily tight regime. And again, it's historically validated. You see this time and again. Tight money, lack of elasticity go with long-term depression.
So, it really does seem to be like this Sisyphean type task where they're pumping in additional liquidity in an attempt to assuage concerns or reduce uncertainty, but they're actually creating more uncertainty over time.
But right? Because they're not actually pumping in liquidity. They're making people think they're pumping in liquidity when they're actually not. That's what I always say. You can't fix a real money problem with a fairy tale. You can't say, I'm creating bank reserves. You're supposed to believe that's effective money, but it's not really effective money. Right. And so the actual system that is starved of effective money doesn't really do much good to think that I'm, creating this fairy tale, I'm pumping liquidity, because they want actual liquidity. Right. And actual liquidity only comes from the dealer banks involved in the system, which they prove time and time again, this negative, this concept of negative elasticity and backwards elasticity. They're risk averse, not risk taking. They're constraining and constricting balance sheets rather than expanding balance sheets. They're not creating the money that the global economy needs to grow because it's a bad system that went wrong a long time ago and just hasn't been fixed. And it hasn't been fixed because nobody knows it needs to be fixed.
Right. Wow.